Hello, History 2 students. This is Mrs. Politsky, and I have notes for Chapter 21, Section 3, Ford and Carter. So here we go. Number 1, what did President Johnson's administration do to cause inflation to rise? And one of the things that Johnson did was he increased deficit spending, meaning spending more money than our government is taking in to fund the Vietnam War and his Great Society programs. And as a result of that, we had a huge deficit that actually incurred. And number 2, what regions provided much of the oil on which the United States depended on? And most of our oil was coming out of the Middle East and Africa. This is kind of going into the early 1970s. And what's going to end up happening because of some politics that were going on is that an organization known as OPEC is going to impose a embargo on Middle Eastern oil on the United States. And as a result of that, our oil prices soared dramatically to the point that a lot of Americans weren't able to afford to buy fuel for their cars and for heating oil to warm their homes in the wintertime. So why did OPEC members stop shipping petroleum to the U.S. in 1973? Part of that was because OPEC stopped shipping oil to countries that had supported Israel in a war against the Arabs. And it all goes back to the Yom Kippur War. As a result of that, many of Americans were really, really hurt. So at number 4, what did high prices of oil-based products mean for Americans? And it meant that Americans had less money to spend on other goods, which led to a recession. This recession kind of morphs itself, and it actually becomes known as stagflation. And part of that is because stagflation is a combination of inflation and stagnating economic growth, along with high unemployment. So the truth is, mid-1970s were a really rough time for a lot of Americans. Got to remember, automobiles were not really fuel efficient. It was not uncommon to have a car or a pickup that got well less than 10 miles a gallon. And so to have oil prices double, in some cases triple, what they had been maybe months prior, it took a really big toll out of people's budgets. And people, for the most part, were really hurting financially. So, number 6, what turned many Americans against detente? And part of that was the fact that the Soviet Union was failing to uphold its human rights agreements that they had made when they signed the Helsinki Accords. The Soviets, for the most part, they were a lot of talk, but as far as actually returning individuals who were being detained or to make concessions on weapons, some of those things really didn't pan out. And so a lot of Americans were ready to pull out of a lot of these agreements. Number 7, what did American voters find appealing about Jimmy Carter? Jimmy Carter was a Democrat who was going to run for president in 1976. He was running against Gerald Ford. And if you remember, Gerald Ford had been a member of the House of Representatives. He was appointed to become vice president when Spiro Agnew had to resign. And when Richard Nixon resigned to president, he becomes president of the United States, making him the first president who was never voted upon by the American people. So in 1976, Carter is going to run against Ford. And because of all the stuff that happened with the Watergate scandal and the fact that Gerald Ford pardoned Richard Nixon shortly after becoming president, many people were ready to get rid of the Republicans. So what did the voters find appealing about Carter? Well, he was a moral man. The fact that he was very upstanding. This is a man who spent a lot of time with Billy Graham, who was a very famous pastor. But probably more importantly is Carter really wasn't an insider in Washington. He had been governor of Georgia. This is a guy who went to the U.S. Naval Academy, had a background in nuclear engineering, and actually worked on a nuclear sub after he left the Naval Academy. But for the most part, he was kind of known as a peanut farmer. in the state of Georgia, or at least his family was. And a lot of people saw him as being very wholesome and not necessarily being corrupted by all the scandals that were taking place in the DC area. So in 1976, these two men, Ford and Carter, are going to butt heads and run against one another. And what's interesting is during a series of debates that's going to take place, somebody asked President Ford whether or not there was really a problem with the Soviets encroaching on the rights of the people of Poland, meaning like the Iron Curtain. And Ford stumbled. For the most part, he said there was no problems whatsoever. And in the debate, Jimmy Carter comes back and says, well, you know, that's not quite the truth. And there have been many, many problems with the fact that the Soviets had taken a lot of the rights away from America or from Poles that were living in Poland, and hence it really was a problem. And Americans saw Carter as being more competent, and thus he's going to win the 1976 election. So, what did Carter feel was the nation's most serious problem when he entered office? And that problem was our dependence on foreign oil. What he was concerned about is better energy consumption. And one of the things that he does in his initial first year in office is he actually makes a Department of Energy, which is going to help us maybe manage our natural resources a little better and maybe find alternatives for petroleum. But needless to say, that might have been the pinnacle of his presidency at that point in time. Number 9, who did Carter appoint as the first African-American ambassador to the United Nations? And that was a good friend of his from the state of Georgia, Andrew Young. Andrew Young had been the mayor of Atlanta, and they were friends because of the civil rights movement, and he obviously had the credentials to be a fine ambassador to the UN. Number 10, what did President Carter do to remove a major symbol of U.S. interventionism in Latin America? And one of the things that he did was he agreed to give back control of the Panama Canal to the people of Panama. They signed an agreement in the late 1970s, and basically they said that the United States would hand back the control of the canal before 1997, which, by the way, we did. We were definitely on that time schedule. But as a result of that, we gave up a lot of control in the canal zone. What used to be a lot of warehousing that was in the hands of American companies actually went back to Panama, and Panama, in many cases, rented them out to other countries. And today, some of those areas that had been once controlled by the United States are actually controlled by China. Number 11, how did President Carter react to the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979? In 1979, Carter wanted to show that he was tough against the Soviets, and he imposed an embargo of grain against the Soviet Union, the USSR. And along with that, he also wanted to boycott the Summer Olympics of 1980. The Winter Olympics of 1980 were held in Lake Placid, New York, and the Summer Games were going to be held in Moscow. And if memory might serve you right, the Miracle on Ice occurred in the Winter Games of 1980, and I think people were ready for the next chapter that was going to happen in the Summer Games, but it never came to be. Many of the nations of the Western world boycotted those games and did not go, and it was more of an Olympics of the Eastern blocs. So needless to say, we're going to pull out of the Olympics. It's very symbolic, but probably more importantly to the Midwest was the fact that grain was embargoed, and it hit American farmers really hard. We were going to start seeing farmers going into bankruptcy, farm commodity prices going down, banks foreclosing on loans that farmers cannot pay off because they do not have the income coming in. So what was Carter's greatest foreign policy triumph? And that came in what was known as the Camp David Agreement. The Camp David Agreement was an agreement between Israel and Egypt that they would recognize each other. Menachem Begin and Anwar Sadat basically went back and forth for several days trying to come up with this agreement, and eventually an agreement is made. And for the most part, between Israel and Egypt, we've had relative peace since this was signed. And in a way, maybe this was Carter's greatest moment. So, number 13, who replaced the Shah of Iran after the country was declared an Islamic Republic? The Shah of Iran was our monarch of Iran. He was a friend of the United States. Matter of fact, he had sold the United States a lot of oil, but he was concerned about the fact that there were people in this country that were kind of making up the lower and middle class people who were demanding more control. They wanted to bring back a stricter form of Islam. And needless to say, when the Shah had a medical crisis and he left the country, the whole country toppled. And we saw a sheikh, or a Shah in this case, a religious cleric named Ayatollah Khomeini, come to power. The Ayatollah Khomeini had been exiled from Iran many years before and had been living in France and making all sorts of tapes for the people that were broadcasted in Iran. And when the Shah left, the Ayatollah came back. And it was a huge revolution that took place. A lot of young people were excited about it. One of the things that the Ayatollah wanted to do is to go back to a more traditional lifestyle in Iran. And many of the rights that women had had under the Shah were taken away from them. Women could no longer wear Western style clothes. They had to basically be veiled at all times. And women who did not comply could go to jail. So, needless to say, we were seeing a lot of drastic changes happening here, and students were all pumped up. And one of the things that they did is they actually stormed the American embassy, and they ended up taking many of the people who were working there hostage. So, in number 14, what was the result of an American attempt to rescue these hostages from our embassy in Tehran, Iran, from these revolutionists, if you want to call it that? And this was a real disaster. This rescue mission failed, part of it because when the helicopters rendezvoused before going into the embassy, they actually collided with one another, and we had about 8 servicemen that were killed. As a result of that, the Iranians, they put that on their newscast. They were burning American flags, and they made effigies of American presidents and were burning those. And for the most part, it was a real hostile time for Americans in that part of the world. Thank you very much.